My name is Monica Hale. I am 32 years old, and until a few weeks ago, I still believed my family cared enough to want me at my brother's wedding. I had the dress steamed, the gift wrapped, and the day marked on my calendar in red. Tomorrow. I even practiced what I would say if things became awkward, because with my family, they always do. So when I stopped by my uncle's place that afternoon and casually said I couldn't wait for the big day, I was not expecting the look he gave me. It was not confusion, it was something closer to dread, the kind of expression people wear when they realize you are about to break. He did not say my name, he did not soften it, he simply said, "The wedding was last week." For a moment, my mind refused to register the words "last week," as in it had already happened, as in everyone was there except me. I felt the floor tilt beneath me the way it does when a plane hits turbulence, except there was no recovery, no captain's voice in my ear, just silence, heavy and humiliating. I opened my phone, and there it was, an entire celebration uploaded for the world to see. Smiling faces, coordinated outfits, toasts, group photos, a perfect day, and my absence so complete it was as if I had never existed at all. I wish I could tell you I walked out calmly, but the truth is simpler. When you realize your own family planned a celebration around excluding you, something inside you does not break, it rearranges. And what happened after that moment is the reason this story exists. Before I tell you what he said and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I am curious to see how far this story will travel. The next morning carried a weight I could not shake. Even as I drove south toward the neighborhood where I grew up, my hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my mind worked like a machine, refusing to power down. I did not plan what I would say or how I might react. I only knew I needed to stand in front of the people who erased me and see whether they could do it to my face. When I pulled into my parents' driveway, the house looked exactly as it always had, calm, orderly, proud of itself in the way only certain suburban homes can be. Nothing about it hinted that a major family event had taken place inside without me, and the normalcy twisted something in my stomach. I stepped out of the car, walked to the door, and heard voices drifting from the living room. They were not subdued or hesitant. They were bright, relaxed, unbothered. I paused in the hallway just long enough to recognize the tone, the same tone people use when they are comfortably gathered, certain no one unexpected will walk in. That certainty broke when the moment I crossed the threshold and they noticed me. Their expressions shifted in subtle ways. Tightened shoulders, narrowed eyes, adjusted postures that said my presence was unwelcome even before anyone decided how to respond. I did not wait for an invitation to speak. I did not wait for anyone to pretend they were glad to see me. I stood there and let the silence press against them. I asked why the wedding date on my invitation did not match the real one. The answer came not in a dramatic outburst, but through small tells, the kind that accumulate quickly. An avoided glance, a measured breath, a dismissive shrug. It was not a mistake. It was not poor communication. It was not an oversight. It was intentional, and none of them bothered to deny it. The explanation hovered somewhere between irritation and justification. I was told, without being directly addressed, that gatherings felt easier without my intensity, that certain moments required a particular kind of atmosphere, that I tended to complicate things by asking questions no one wanted to answer. It struck me that they spoke as though I were not fully present, as if acknowledging me directly might. They had grown accustomed to a version of family life in which I was a background character, useful when needed, forgettable when not. And because I worked hard, paid my bills, handled emergencies alone, and didn't bring them problems, it was easy for them to treat me as optional. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. The shock had passed, leaving only clarity. If they wanted a version of family in which I was invisible, they had already built it long before I walked into that room. Amid it all, something else surfaced, something they weren't expecting. When discussions turned to properties, responsibilities, and money tied to the family name, I noticed a flicker of entitlement I had never fully registered before. The lake house I had poured so much into, the one I maintained, the one I handled tax notices for, was spoken about as if it belonged to some collective identity that automatically excluded my personal investment. It wasn't anger that rose in me then, it was recognition. Recognition that they relied on the parts of me they didn't acknowledge. Recognition that supporting them had become an expectation rather than gratitude. Recognition that stepping away from this dynamic would cost them far more than it would cost me. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. Their version of the truth had been rehearsed long before I arrived. Instead, I let the room hold its tension and let each person feel whatever discomfort my presence brought. Then I turned away first, not because I was defeated, but because I finally understood that I didn't need to keep proving myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. Walking back to my car, an unexpected steadiness settled over me. They had shown me exactly where I stood, and now that the line was visible, I could decide what to do with it. A quiet stretch of highway carried me away from the confrontation, and by the time the trees thickened along the waterline, my destination had already formed in my mind. I needed space to think, and there was only one place that had ever offered me that without conditions: the lake house. Not the version my family romanticized, but the real one. Imperfect, aging, demanding upkeep that only I seemed willing to handle. When I stepped inside, the familiar creak of the floorboards met me like a reminder of every repair I had ever scheduled, every invoice I had ever paid. The air smelled faintly of cedar, the same sense that used to ground me when my life felt too crowded. Now, it simply made room for the truth settling in my chest. I dropped my keys on the counter and went straight to the storage cabinet where I kept all documents related to the property. I wasn't searching for anything specific, I just needed clarity. I pulled out the folders and spread them across the dining table. Page after page revealed a financial history I hadn't consciously tallied before. Roof repairs, plumbing work, annual taxes, pest control, winterizing services, emergency fixes after storms. Every cost fell back to me, often without acknowledgement, sometimes without thanks. My signature appeared so consistently, it was as if the lake house had been legally mine long before I realized it emotionally belonged only to me. As I flipped deeper into the stack, I found older papers tied to a different kind of obligation. Transfers made to support ventures that were never mine, loans co-signed during periods when no one else stepped forward, payments written off as family responsibility but never shared equally. I recognized the pattern instantly. Even though I had never named it out loud, I was the reliable one, the silent safety net. And because I never asked for anything, they assumed I needed nothing. The realization didn't sting. It settled with the weight of something long overdue. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes move across the room. Memories lived in the corners. The weekends I spent repairing what others ignored, the evenings I worked remotely from the porch to meet deadlines while handling insurance calls simultaneously. My phone vibrated on the table, breaking the quiet. A group message from relatives lit the screen, full of assumptions and judgments disguised as concern. They wrote about misunderstandings, about how I should be more supportive, about avoiding unnecessary tension. No one asked what had actually happened. No one asked if I was okay. Their words pushed me further into the seat rather than drawing me back toward them. I didn't reply. I didn't owe anyone a performance of calm. Instead, I opened my contacts and tapped the name of the only person who had ever told me the truth without trying to shape it, Chloe. When she answered, the sound of her voice steadied something inside me. I told her I needed advice, not comfort. I needed clarity, not cheerleading. She listened without interruption, then suggested what I already sensed was necessary: professional guidance, someone who could parse the financial reality without the emotional distortion my family relied on. That was how the name surfaced: Natalie Cruz, an attorney Chloe trusted. I hesitated only long enough to acknowledge how significant it felt to reach outside the family for help. Then I sent the email, attaching a brief description of what I wanted to review: property records, financial ties, obligations I no longer wished to carry alone. When I clicked send, the room seemed to exhale with me. I gathered the folders into a neater stack, not because order mattered, but because I needed to treat each document as proof of something important. Not proof of burden, but proof of investment, effort, income, and commitment that no one else had matched. The lake house had survived storms, repairs, neglect, and eventual renewal. So had I. As the sun lowered outside, the windows caught the shifting light in warm patches across the floor. I didn't feel calm, but I felt certain. The next steps wouldn't be simple, and they wouldn't be quiet, but they would be mine. 2 days later, I walked into a glass-walled conference room downtown and finally put my life on the table in front of me. Across from me sat an attorney named Natalie Cruz. She opened a folder with measured movements and laid out what she had already reviewed: deed, tax notices, service contracts, a notarized agreement. My name appeared again and again. Seeing it printed on every line turned years of vague unease into something solid. Natalie drew a line under the deed and tapped the margin. In even, unhurried language, she explained what the documents already stated. Legally, the lake house belonged to me. The signatures that had once transferred it out of my parents' names were there in ink. The bills I had paid weren't generous gestures, they were part of an ownership I had already assumed. On the other side of the table, a second stack waited. Stephen Ward, the financial advisor Chloe had recommended, walked me through account histories and loan files. Credit lines opened temporarily for a relative, restaurant funding guaranteed by my income, automatic payments drawn from my accounts whenever due dates crept up on someone else. He spoke in the neutral vocabulary of interest rates and liability, but beneath the numbers was a blunt fact. I had been the safety net. The system worked because I didn't say no. Sitting between them, I felt exposed and oddly relieved. No one in that room was invested in protecting my family's version of events. They were simply reading what was in front of them and returning the reality to me. Natalie summarized it without spin. The lake house was not a shared family asset or a sentimental group project. It was my property. Whatever story my relatives preferred had no force beyond their own conversations. Stephen followed with his own conclusion. My position as guarantor on certain debts could change. It would take time, and some institutions would resist, but cosigner status could be removed, accounts closed, authorizations revoked. None of it would be pleasant. All of it was possible. We outlined next steps: letters to send, calls to make, passwords to reset. By the time I left the conference room, I carried a thin envelope of copies and a much heavier awareness of what I had allowed in the name of keeping peace. Downstairs, the lobby of my office building hummed with lunchtime noise, yet the air felt off, the way a room does when an argument has just ended or is about to begin. Near the reception desk, the flow of foot traffic had slowed. I followed the line of sight and saw 3 figures at the counter, shoulders tight, gestures sharp. My parents stood closest to the desk. My brother flanked them, planted like a second wall. Even from a distance, I recognized the way their bodies angled forward, claiming space that wasn't theirs. This was not a visit. It was an attempt to force their way into a place they didn't control. The receptionist's polite smile had gone stiff. She leaned back slightly, away from the pressure of their insistence. I stopped beside a structural column, far enough that they didn't register me, close enough to understand exactly what they were doing. They were demanding access to me on their terms, in a place where my work usually insulated me from their moods. They were dragging our private chaos into the one environment where I had any real authority. Owen Miles, the security guard who usually greeted me with a nod in the mornings, stepped toward them. His presence alone shifted the balance. He asked questions, directed them away from the reception desk, and calmly reminded them that the building had policies for visitors. My family did not like being told no by anyone. When Owen pulled out his small incident notebook and began to write, something inside me loosened. For once, someone other than me was documenting their behavior. There would be a record that didn't depend on whether anyone believed my version later. I didn't step forward to smooth things over or explain. I let the distance stand, both literal and symbolic. They had created the scene, they could live inside it. An elevator opened nearby. I stepped in, pressed my floor, and let the doors close on the lobby, the raised voices, and the assumption that I would always come running. The following afternoon settled into a stillness that felt unfamiliar, and I was beginning to think the day would end without interruption when a car pulled into the gravel drive. A moment later, a knock sounded at the door, gentle, deliberate, unmistakable. When I opened it, my uncle, Victor Dean, stood on the porch holding a worn leather briefcase that no longer belonged to any job he still had. He didn't launch into explanations. He simply stepped inside and set the briefcase on the table, his expression carrying the weight of something he had debated sharing for far too long. When he unclasped the case, a stack of folders emerged, thick, uneven, filled to their edges. He told me he had kept these documents for years, not out of malice, but out of fear of how certain truths would be twisted if left in the wrong hands. One folder after another revealed patterns I recognized but had never fully traced. Messages discussing how to convince me to take on a repair bill, emails strategizing how to present debts as small favors, budget spreadsheets outlining expenses that were intentionally hidden before my visits. There were even exchanges about the lake house, notes about concealing structural issues, requests to postpone discussing costs until Monica is in a good mood, suggestions that I could be persuaded to sign whatever was needed if approached the right way. Reading their private words felt like opening a door I had spent my entire life knocking on. Suddenly, I was on the inside, and I didn't want to be. I didn't speak. I let each page tell its own story. The pattern was consistent. I had been treated as a resource, not a relative. When Natalie Cruz arrived later that evening, she didn't react with shock. She reacted with method. She sorted the documents quickly, grouping messages into categories: financial manipulation, misrepresentation, attempts to shift legal responsibility. Her pen moved in clean, precise strokes. As she built a time, she pointed to one email chain in particular, where repairs had been intentionally mischaracterized to convince me that minor work was needed, when the real issue was far more costly. The discrepancy mattered. It demonstrated intent. Natalie's voice remained even as she explained how patterns like this shaped legal interpretation. Evidence wasn't just transactions, it was behavior. A little later, Stephen Ward joined us with his laptop. He reviewed account records against the messages, cross-checking dates, authorizations, and withdrawals I had never been informed about. Where I had once seen an unfortunate series of financial leaks, Stephen saw a coordinated reliance on my stability. He highlighted the term default avoidance strategy in several documents, language my family wouldn't have written themselves. Someone had sent these descriptions to a financial consultant years ago. Someone had deliberately planned how to shift burdens onto me. By the time Stephen finished, the full picture had crystallized into something impossible to excuse. Outside, the sky was turning the deep shade of early evening, and the lake reflected a muted glow. Inside, a quiet settled after the analysis, heavy but clarifying. Natalie closed the final folder and delivered a sentence that landed like a verdict. The cumulative record demonstrated recurring exploitation rather than isolated misunderstandings. When they left, I sat alone with the evidence scattered across the table. The papers didn't make me angry, they made me certain. Certainty wasn't loud, it was steady. Over the next week, the consequences began to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. A cousin canceled regular plans with my mother after hearing part of the story from Victor. An old family friend declined an invitation, noting that she couldn't support the narrative being told about me. Distance began to form, not around me, but around the people who had long believed they controlled the story. Meanwhile, she pointed to one email chain in particular, where repairs had been intentionally mischaracterized to convince me that minor work was needed, when the real issue was far more costly. The discrepancy mattered. It demonstrated intent. Natalie's voice remained even as she explained how patterns like this shaped legal interpretation. Evidence wasn't just transactions, it was behavior. A little later, Stephen Ward joined us with his laptop. He reviewed account records against the messages, cross-checking dates, authorizations, and withdrawals I had never been informed about. Where I had once seen an unfortunate series of financial leaks, Stephen saw a coordinated reliance on my stability. He highlighted the term default avoidance strategy in several documents, language my family wouldn't have written themselves. Someone had sent these descriptions to a financial consultant years ago. Someone had deliberately planned how to shift burdens onto me. By the time Stephen finished, the full picture had crystallized into something impossible to excuse. Outside, the sky was turning the deep shade of early evening, and the lake reflected a muted glow. Inside, a quiet settled after the analysis, heavy but clarifying. Natalie closed the final folder and delivered a sentence that landed like a verdict. The cumulative record demonstrated recurring exploitation rather than isolated misunderstandings. When they left, I sat alone with the evidence scattered across the table. The papers didn't make me angry, they made me certain. Certainty wasn't loud, it was steady. Over the next week, the consequences began to ripple outward in ways I hadn't anticipated. A cousin canceled regular plans with my mother after hearing part of the story from Victor. An old family friend declined an invitation, noting that she couldn't support the narrative being told about me. Distance began to form, not around me, but around the people who had long believed. I agreed only after arranging the meeting in a community space where neutrality was non-negotiable. When my parents and brother arrived, the air around them felt uncertain, as though they were trying to inhabit humility without understanding its shape. I listened as they made indirect references to how difficult things had become, how temporary adjustments might be avoided if access to the lake house were granted. Their phrasing danced around responsibility, searching for sympathy without acknowledging harm. They did not speak of the wedding, the deception, or the years of quiet extraction. Instead, they appealed to family, as if the word itself were enough to erase everything that had led us here. Their request never formed a direct question, but the expectation was unmistakable. Reopen the door, restore what they had lost, resume the role they had depended on. For the first time, I did not feel torn. I did not feel guilty or cruel. I felt clear. I explained, not harshly but steadily, that the lake house would not be available to them in any capacity, that financial ties had been severed, not paused, that boundaries were not punishment. They were an overdue correction to a dynamic that had consumed more of me than anyone had ever acknowledged. Their expressions shifted between disbelief and offense, as though my decisiveness were an act of aggression rather than autonomy. But I did not bend. I did not soften the edges to make it palatable. I simply held the line, the one I should have drawn years ago. When the meeting ended, they left in a silence that carried no understanding, only disappointment that their expectations no longer governed my choices. I walked away without looking back. The moment did not feel triumphant. It felt final. Days passed with a new kind of quiet, one that did not demand vigilance. I spent evenings at the lake house learning how to enjoy stillness without anticipating intrusion. Chloe visited often, bringing laughter that carried no hidden costs. Victor sent updates only when necessary, respecting the boundaries I had set. Natalie and Stephen completed the remaining paperwork, closing the chapter with precision. The distance from my family did not feel like a loss. It felt like space. Space to build a life that did not depend on their approval or their comfort. Space to choose what stayed and what no longer had a place beside me. And in that space, I understood something I had never allowed myself to accept. Family is not defined by shared blood, but by shared respect. If someone repeatedly asks you to diminish yourself so they can stand taller, they are not your foundation. They are your burden. Walking along the edge of the lake one evening, the water calm beneath a fading sky, I realized the greatest consequence was not what they had lost. It was what I had gained, a life that finally belonged to me. If my story made you pause, reflect, or recognize something in your own life, thank you for staying until the end. And before you go, tell me where you are listening from. I would love to know how far this journey reached.